Well, I want to join in thanking, really, Hitan, the Royal Statistical Society, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the Resolution Foundation for organising this on what I hope will be a regular basis as an infrastructure. It's thrilling to see so many organisations here that range from those that care about research and data and those that use it and benefit from having it. And I do think one of the ways that we've not helped hold public debate to account is recognising we need to be fleeter of foot, not just in discussing the policy content of issues to do with poverty and disadvantage, inequality perhaps, but also to think about what we need in the way of architecture or infrastructure to hold policy to account. Now, I have to admit, I was originally planning to talk for only about 7 or 8 minutes about some rather things that I think are really important to do with a white paper on data sharing and the EU proposed data directive, and I will talk about those. But I wanted to start with the news this morning that we'd lost our MP with a little bit of just some thoughts, and these are very much personal thoughts, on the mantra of evidence-based policy and maybe why we haven't been as successful as we'd like to be in developing that in a way that really does do as much as it should to hold people to account. And I don't mean that in any naive way. Now, it may surprise you that personally, I don't think I believe in evidence-based policy, if you meant that literally. You know, policy is also partly about the aims and the ends, and it's not just doing, you know, school philosophy that you learn something about that. It's also realizing that really we do still have a debate about whether inequality per se matters. And that is to do, not just as was said earlier with the measures of poverty, but what we could expect to happen if you took inequality more seriously in a time of low growth. I've been surprised at some of the work that we funded jointly with JRF in the case of a project the LSE and Manchester have done called Social Policy in a Cold Climate, and work that we funded IFS to do with its green budget and so on, that it does seem quite clear that many of the benefit cuts and the changes in welfare and low incomes have actually been financed. They've been used, as it were, to finance changes in the tax distribution more generally. They haven't really had an independent effect on deficit reduction. So what you've done is you've seen a shift in income distribution, and there's now some very good data about that. Hasn't made quite the stir you might have thought, and partly it's because it preaches to those that kind of knew it and aren't surprised by it. And then there are those that say, well, that's not really something we want to talk about. So we're not very good as a community at holding those sorts of bigger aims to any evidence-based scrutiny. But in a week where we've also had 2 really quite confusing Guardian articles on this issue, one, I think a scurrilous leader decrying those who believe in numbers, but I understand what they're saying. You know, policy isn't just reduced to evidence. That was the constructive point in that leader. But then it all ended up in a kind of rant about how, well, it's just all too difficult, and if we take education league tables and try to argue about value added, it exposes the fact that different people have different views. And I kind of thought, first of all, that it's too difficult is not helpful. Secondly, isn't it precisely the point that having to make things precise in numbers helps illuminate some of these differences in what your underlying values and aims are? So it's not just that they tell you what works, it's they help you focus, why do you have the different evaluation you do? And I think that's really, again, something we as a community in the social statistics world, and poverty statistics part of that, aren't as good as we should be about it. So if I start by thinking that evidence can't be and shouldn't be probably the only basis for policy setting, that we do have to think about values and beliefs. That is part of what democratic decision-making as a kind of mantra is supposed to be about. But evidence is important in judging those means-ends comparisons, and that was something the Social Policy in a Cold Climate project was at great pains to do, to set out with what were the intended aims. Did these policies achieve those? Who won, who lost from those? That's very important. And as I said, that in turn informs, well, what's at stake in those different aims? Now, I don't want to blame the media, but I do think we live in a world which makes it very hard to go from an abstract notion of evidence can hold democracy to account, to what does that mean institutionally? On the one hand, we do have the benefit of much strengthened parliamentary select committees. With the coming of elected chairs and so on, they really are much strengthened. But too few of us make sure that those parliamentary select committees get the information they need. And when they do, it's often in the form of a lone individual or two, rather than the Poverty Statistics Users Forum, behaving in the way that, for instance, the Demographic Users Forum, also supported by the RSS, does. So that you've actually got a body which brings some weight and some voice to say, we think this select committee needs to ask these questions. We have pre-packaged some of the data for you. I agree about data visualization and so on, but this is never going to be an area that suddenly, except for very rare circumstances, people are out on the barricades. What we need is to use those institutional levers better and more swiftly and in a more timely fashion ourselves. So, for instance, we've spent quite a lot of time, quite a lot of money in the last few years funding not only the Social Policy in a Cold Climate Project, IFS's green budgets, IFS's election briefings, Full Fact as a fact-checking website, but it's still very hard to build up a social media presence, and nowadays increasingly, you've got to think about the individualization of the world we live in. It makes media itself less well-funded, fewer social affairs correspondents, and so on. And that means that actually you don't have to tackle the P word. And I remember too, in an earlier incarnation, in an early phase of British Social Attitudes, a long conversation with a senior government minister about whether we could use the word poverty given that the question was about what people thought about poverty and it was in the question wording. It was really a very difficult conversation. But we aren't very good at thinking about things that would interject our concerns in that policy-friendly, evidence-friendly policy environment. So, for instance, I think it's true, but I hope we may be funding some work to look at this, that in the last 4 years there's been quite a lot less government spending on external, independent and published evaluation of programs. And I don't just mean RCTs, because I think many government programs should be piloted, or we should be looking at evaluations which may or may not be suitable for RCTs, so that's fine. But if you look, for instance, at the Hefke report on the REF, the Research Excellence Framework findings, and those of you who aren't academics, it's a way of doling out money to universities for kind of core infrastructure, as well as presenting many, many league tables, which many a statistician spends their time on. If you look at the Hefke report published at the end of December from Main Panel C about the background context for social science research in Britain, you'll see a graph which shows quite a marked decline in external government funding. That is not university core funding, but commissioned government research to government departments of social science. That's one piece of a puzzle. But I suspect if we were to look at the proportion of money that were spent on evaluations or pilots of some of the changes, if you look at the Troubled Families program, where there's not really been a robust pilot and so on, we would find it was lessened. And I think that's something we are thinking about. Should we be looking and saying it's not about the number of internal analysts and statisticians, it's about what kinds of published evaluations get done. Because that does then have this role of strengthening parliamentary select committees, the executive, and indeed, dare I say it, the kind of NGOs and civil society organizations who do require more and better use of evidence. And it also means taking seriously the consultation already mentioned on the English Housing Survey, which will close in about a month's time, and having some sort of concerted response about that. We're doing some work to fund ways of possibly considering other statutory funders for the Wealth and Assets Survey, because, again, that has been whittled back because it's expensive, I understand that, but it is a really important source of getting at some wealth and non-income-based data that we don't have. We have a question of, at times, very long gaps, 2-3 year gaps of depositing the HBAI data in the data archive. I think FRS, the Family Resources Survey, is now more or less up to date, but we need external pressure to keep pointing out when the resources aren't there for that. So having a users group who is fleet of foot and actually keeping track of these things and does the external pressure, unlike those of us few funders who appear like Cassandra every year and say, please DWP, I have to write your permanent secretary, we're not getting our data on time. We need more pressure. Now, will now turn very quickly to the two other items that I would have spoken to. First is, many of you will know about government plans which should have already seen the production of a white paper on data linkage and sharing, and that was originally scheduled, well, it was originally scheduled a while ago, I won't even say how long, but it was rescheduled for January, and it hasn't yet appeared. And I have to say, I think taking the time to write a white paper is in itself a good thing, because it means you have a proper consultation, and the fact that it hasn't appeared worries me a little. There's no question from where I sit that we do need legislation to clarify the circumstances under which we can bring together survey-based data, which is very deep, very thick, very rich, with administrative data like exam results or benefit receipts or whatever. And the current situation we're finding when we fund work of this sort depends on the government department. Some are better than others. One day I'll work with the RSS to produce a golden spoon award and a kind of clay spoon award. But we're currently finding it can take about 2 years to arrange that access. That guarantees you lack of timeliness. So if you think that the data are there, and then it's 2 years after the data are there that you can get it, you're talking about 4 or 5 years afterwards. The plans that government had were for 3 strands, but the 2 that might exercise this group most particularly is a strand of legislation for research purposes, ensuring clarity of expectations, but protection for people for that linkage for research, and another was for government action to combat fraud. And I sat through a number of consultation debates. I understand the complexity of that latter point. We tend to do it for benefit fraud, but not perhaps, as recent news has shown, for tax fraud. But on the other hand, the question is, can you have the same framework? And I think my answer is some of that could be the same and some not. But what I want to talk about here is for research purposes, because it seems unclear to me, others of you may know more directly, whether or not we will get a white paper this side of the election, and therefore what any government will do, because this is not a vote winner. This is not a high priority. And I understand why, but the privacy lobby will speak very loudly, and most of the rest of us mutter. So I think we do need a clearer framework. I hope getting some pressure again to get that out should involve, for instance, us working together. And can I point to the excellent work the ESRC has done with the Administrative Data Network, and also the work that it funded along with ONS, Ipsos Mori, to do on public views about data linkage and sharing, which I'll come back to. But we need to be taking up that mantra and to engage with the discussion about the public benefits of having that kind of research evidence that does hold people to account, and then taking some responsibility, not just to produce the evidence, but through organizations to get it to the right places so that it will do so. And I think I'd make there an argument, and this probably does betray my values, not just cold light of reason, that after all, one of the roles of evidence in this area is to speak about the real effects of various policies and so on by those who don't tend to speak for themselves. They don't tend to engage in the political process. And I think I'd make a sociological argument about the long-term growing disengagement through no unions, not having the same sorts of collective infrastructures, good and ill, that actually kept those interests more directly in political play. So evidence may be weak, but evidence, I think, has that role. Now, finally, I want to say this does require taking privacy seriously, and not just privacy, but the range of interests of those that take part in research, to make sure that we think about the risks of the harms versus the benefits. And actually the social science and social statistics community, I think, has really been on the side of the angels here. There have not been the same concerns that we've seen, not just back in the 30s or in the 50s, but as recently as 2 years ago with care.data, the concerns about what kind of safeguards were in place for data sharing and data use of public data and who it would benefit. And that's because we have long, as a community, had a very clear sense of a strong set of safeguards. They've been strengthened over time, but it's because they aren't just based on individual consent or even the characteristics of the data themselves, much as we who fund in this area can talk for ages about whether data have been truly anonymized and what level of pseudo-anonymization. If you think poverty is a hard sell, try selling that in a public debate. But we need to be talking more clearly about what I think of as the 5 pillars, the 5 supports for any framework that help us feel confident about using and sharing data. And we need not only to make sure these are in place, but we need to be more active in promoting support of them as a robust protective framework. So they include, of course, the characteristics of the data itself. It's why we've got to say not all data can be open data. We've invented the ugly term pseudo-anonymization because we know it's not truly anonymous. We all know that with sufficiently fine gradations, with a modicum of pre-existing information, and the determination or even the incentive to identify individuals, this is a relative concept. We need to feel less defensive and say, we make sure it's anonymized as far as possible to protect people, but there are other factors that come into play in our discussion. Second is about consent, that individuals agree with reasonably informed consent to permit use of their data. But that is not the same as specific consent. That means people have a good general sense of what you'll use it, and more importantly, they understand what safeguards you've put in place. And I think the ESRC, ONS, MORI dialogue on data is really a very good way of saying, these are the points we need to be getting across. We tell them we have put additional safeguards in place. Another safeguard is the security with which the data are held. And that ranges from data encryption, from safe digital, physical settings, and so on. Now, I have a concern here that what we're seeing increasingly is just a ratcheting up, so that eventually everything is going to be in a safe room data setting if we're not careful. And we need to feel more confident and engage and say, these are safe, non-hackable, protected settings. Probably more important, and something we've not been good at selling, is that there is a public benefit test. And a key question here is judged by whom? And this is an issue for the legislation where I think there are very mixed views about whether you put in the legislation public benefit, because you might then have to make the argument, and I think an argument could be made, but I didn't hear it made, about why releasing health data to insurance companies for premium setting was a public benefit. I mean, I could make an argument about market efficiency, but I didn't hear the argument being made. And I'm not saying I believe the argument, I'm just saying I could make one. So that's why the ESRC, the Foundation, other funders of research spent so much time a decade ago trying to strengthen, and we understood the risks, independent ethical review procedures and criteria that involved publication of results as part of a public benefit test. If your results aren't public, how is it in the public's benefit? Again, I could make an argument about national security, but I don't think that's mainly the world we're living in here. So I think we need to feel that we've got that in place, and the Administrative Data Network has a strengthened version. And finally, the system requires undertakings by researchers and routes such as approved researchers. So you have to actually say what you're going to do, you have to be approved, you have to do it under certain settings, and there are sanctions if you identify someone or allow someone to be identified, or identify them accidentally and don't tell someone. So that's very important. Now that's a much stronger system than is in place with commercial users of data, where we tick our boxes about cookies quite regularly, quite quickly. But we need to more proactively promote it, and a statistics forum focused on poverty and deprivation needs to be a strong and engaged participant in that public debate. And if we look at the EU data protection regulation, many of you will know that last year, EU parliamentarians passed a bill proposing that in any safeguards for data linkage, including health and social science research, the key factor was specific consent. That would mean that each time someone wanted to do a new analysis or link new data or raise new questions, you'd have to go back to all the participants and say, this is what we're planning to do you agree? Now, I understand the historical reasons why the German parliamentarians took this up, have such concerns about that. And this is actually a mirror of the debate they had about their own census back in the 80s and 90s. But this would rule out almost all robust social research of the sort people here care about, since in practice the numbers opting in would be small and unrepresentative, much less the cost of every time you wanted to do it, sending it out and people move and all those things. It would just mean it wouldn't happen. So we've really got to work together to say specific consent is not the solution. And in fact, many bioethicists and other ethicists would join us on that. There is a kind of chimera of a notion of the perfectly informed specific consent. And even the doctors have now realized there's good empirical evidence that the longer the consent form is, the less informed your consent can be. And more importantly, that research exemption ignores my other 4 pillars and a robust promotion of the public benefits of having that. Now, the health and medical funders have been much quicker off the mark to see this as a worry. They've actively engaged the users and beneficiaries of the research, the patient groups, to say why having such research is essential and why specific consent is not the answer. But it won't just be statisticians that matter here. It's the child poverty action groups. It's the gingerbread. It's all of the groups that use data that need to think about engaging with this European debate. And the next stages will involve EU commissioners and national governments, and this will take some time. But in the next few weeks, we, the RSS, the ESRC, and others, I think, will be drafting a kind of statement or letter that we hope many of you will agree to sign and take forward, but more importantly, use your other European networks, your continental colleagues, particularly if you're not a statistician or a researcher, but if you're someone who cares and uses those data to engage with this debate and simply say, we understand privacy worries, we're not cavalier, but specific consent is not the answer. Otherwise, we risk a greater weakening of the already perhaps weak infrastructure for evidence-informed debate, and the use of that to allow the scrutiny, democratic scrutiny of poverty policies, not only in the UK, but on the continent. Thank you.